The night of July 24, 1943, caught the inhabitants of the German city of Hamburg by surprise. Bombers of the British Royal Air Force attacked the city with the aim of weakening the German military industry. For nearly an hour, the British bombers dropped more than 2,000 tons of explosives and incendiary bombs that plunged the city into chaos. The objective of the attack was to harm German morale, and it succeeded. Hospitals, schools, and churches were set on fire. More than 5,000 buildings were completely destroyed, leaving over 100,000 people homeless who, once the bombing was over, had to care for nearly 5,000 injured and bury the 1,500 dead. But this was only the beginning of Operation Gomorrah. It was 9 o'clock in the morning on July 25, 1943, in Hamburg. Everything was dark, as if it was still night. The rays of the sun could not penetrate the thick smoke that prevented citizens from seeing what was happening outside their shelters and the few houses still standing. It was only at 11 o'clock that daylight began to clear, but it was not until 3 in the afternoon that the sun finally shone and revealed to the inhabitants the devastation caused by the bombing. Everyone was tired and afraid. The sound of bombs falling on the city still echoed in their minds. The British Royal Air Force had engaged in a true orgy the previous night. Thanks to an innovative technology known as window, they managed to outsmart the German anti-aircraft defenses and attack the city without any opposition. The British bombers first dropped high-explosive bombs to destroy roofs, windows, and weaken building structures. Then, the following waves of planes dropped incendiary bombs that caused nearly uncontrollable fires for several days. But this chaos triggered by the British planes was far from an accident. Unintentionally, Germany itself had contributed to the thinking of the Royal Air Force High Command that incendiary bombs could cause more damage than explosive bombs. The British experience facing the Nazi bombing campaign known as the Blitz had been crucial. Since 1941, the British had begun studying how to inflict more damage during bombings. Researchers from the Royal Air Force studied how German houses were built and conducted several tests to determine the effectiveness of incendiary bombing. They also calculated the exact proportion of explosive and incendiary bombs to use. The powerful explosives were meant to blow out windows, destroy roofs, and make attempts to extinguish fires risky. Meanwhile, the quantity of incendiary bombs had to exceed the German capacity to fight the flames. The British also decided to drop delayed action bombs to prevent any attempts to put out the fires. But the bombing of Hamburg was not the first British assault on German territory. The Bomber Command of the Royal Air Force had carried out raids on Germany since the early days of the war to hit military targets. But the dark landscapes made it difficult to locate the target city, and even more so the specific military target, making navigation imprecise and bombings ineffective. All these failures were highlighted in the Butt report presented to the British War Cabinet. This report analysed 600 images from raids in Germany and revealed that only 1/3 of crews who reached the target had managed to drop bombs within an 8-kilometer radius of it. The solution was simple: enlarge the size of the bombing targets. From 1940 onward, the idea that the German civilian population could be a legitimate target within the framework of total war began to develop. The Royal Air Force no longer considered civilian casualties as collateral damage in an attack on a military target. It was now ready to deliberately target civilians to break their morale. The goal was to undermine the morale of the citizens and thus reduce German war industrial production. Factories ceased to be the targets. Now, it was the workers and their homes. Factories were relatively difficult to destroy, but not the workers' houses. By studying the effects of German bombings on Great Britain, the British discovered that absenteeism of workers displaced by the destruction of their homes caused more delays in production than bombs falling on factories. Air Marshal Arthur Harris took command of the Royal Air Force Bomber Command in February 1942. A few days later, the 8th Air Force of the U.S. Army Air Forces established a headquarters in the United Kingdom to deploy its units in Britain. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt believed that bombings had the potential to win the war. Winston Churchill was also optimistic about the idea of bombing Germany. Thus, despite criticism, the British and American Air Forces received the political support necessary to continue their research. The Americans, for their part, had already shown great interest in British research on the effects of incendiary bombs. They decided to collaborate, bringing their experience and capabilities to the planning of bombings on German cities. However, the American aviation preferred to use petroleum-based bombs rather than the British thermite version with a magnesium casing. It did not take long to determine which bomb was the most effective. It was 3:30 p.m. when citizens cleaning the rubble of Hamburg heard the air raid sirens again. Unlike the passivity of the previous day, this time panic and anguish filled hearts. Mothers took their children by the hand and fled with their husbands to the first air raid shelter they could find. Once inside, they had to squeeze together with other families also seeking to survive. Survivors of this day testified that they had never seen the inhabitants of Hamburg run with such panic during a bombing. A month earlier, the American Air Force had tried to attack the city, but their incursion was repelled by German defenses, which shot down 18 aircraft without suffering any losses. The Americans were still inexperienced, but Brigadier General Fred Anderson, appointed commander of the Air Force only 3 weeks earlier, was determined to support the British in Operation Gomorrah. For the first time in World War II, the Allied air forces combined their efforts to destroy the same military target. A formation of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers from the United States 8th Air Force approached Hamburg from the North Sea. The American planes did not use the window system employed by their British counterparts, but they still had a plan to deceive the Nazi defenses. Anderson and his team ordered 3 American squadrons to take off from the UK towards Germany. The first 2 fleets flew together until 90 kilometers from the Danish coast before splitting up. One of these groups headed towards Warnemünde to lure German fighters northward. The second took the direction of the Kiel shipyards. Additionally, the US Air Force High Command ordered fighter-bomber incursions into France and the Netherlands to create distractions and further disperse German defenses. The third force to take off from the British Isles was composed of 6 bombardment groups totaling 123 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses. The B-17s approached Hamburg in tight formation at an altitude of about 7,000 to 8,000 meters. They used the Norden bomb site, which theoretically allowed surgical strikes on industrial targets. Groups 379, 303, and 384 were to attack the Blom and Voss shipyards. Meanwhile, the Klöckner engine factories were targeted by groups 91, 351, and 381. The wing assigned to Blom and Voss formed without difficulty. However, the group tasked with striking Klöckner had problems with the summer mist and got lost, which complicated their formation. Despite these difficulties, the bombers managed to regroup, although imperfectly. At 4 p.m., the pilots spotted the German coast, but the formation remained loose. Meanwhile, those who were supposed to attack Kiel had to abandon the mission. Nevertheless, many German fighters were diverted to attack the force heading toward Warnemünde. The American aviators en route to Hamburg saw small groups of German Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters appear, awaiting reinforcements. Eventually, 30 German planes attacked the American B-17s, but only managed to shoot down 2. The diversionary attacks in France and the Netherlands also had the intended effect. With German fighters occupied, Hamburg was once again vulnerable. The bombing formation crossed the Elbe estuary at 4:15 p.m., entering German territory. No aircraft had been shot down, although 14 B-17s had to return to base due to mechanical problems. The next 20 minutes were crucial for the American Air Force. German defenses had activated, and the anti-aircraft fire was so intense that metal fragments pierced the fuselage of the B-17s. That was the risk of attacking in broad daylight. Unlike the Royal Air Force bombers, which operated at night, the American crews exposed themselves to German fire in full daylight. The anti-aircraft fire worsened as they approached Hamburg. Despite German attempts to drive off the American bombers, no North American unit was shot down. At 4:40 p.m., the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses reached Hamburg. They then faced a problem they had not anticipated. Due to the British bombing, dense smoke covered the city, hindering the crew's vision and preventing precise identification of targets. Only a few buildings of the Blom and Voss shipyard were visible, but the other key target, the Klöckner factory, remained invisible. Thus, 2 of the 3 groups assigned to attack the factory decided to join the bombing of the shipyard. Only the 381st Group followed its original mission, but, arriving 20 minutes late, decided to jettison their bombs without dropping their payload. The B-17s dropped their bombs on anything that seemed to be an industrial structure, even attacking residential areas. Where a small opening appeared between the curtains of smoke, tons of incendiary bombs were released. The 384th Group dropped 20 tons of petroleum-based incendiary bombs. The other groups dropped about 200 additional tons of explosives. The smoke could not protect the German buildings. The damage was mixed but significant. Some shipyard buildings were hit, notably the foundry, which caught fire, delaying submarine construction for a time. However, the dry docks remained intact. But the shipyard was not the only important structure damaged. The Hansen and Moeller oil factory was hit during the attack. The port warehouses burned all night, as did the ocean liner Vaterland, which, being unfinished, also served as a depot. A power plant was also bombed, plunging the city into a blackout. Before 5 p.m., the attacks ended, and the bombers began their return. The 381st Group, delayed, had to face anti-aircraft artillery alone. Nevertheless, no American planes were shot down, but almost all were damaged. As they moved away from Hamburg, the American planes were attacked over the North Sea by German fighters. Some B-17s lost formation and were shot down without difficulty. 11 units were shot down during the return, 5 of which belonged to the 384th Group. The American Air Force lost 15 planes out of the 123 B-17s deployed against the city, representing a 12% loss rate of the units engaged, a rate that was too high. However, the German fighters suffered significant losses, with at least 5 Messerschmitt Bf-109s shot down. However, by 7 p.m., the American bombers had crossed the English coast. Behind them remained the city of Hamburg, struck but not with the same intensity as during the British attack. Several residential neighborhoods were damaged, and the bombing caused 20 civilian casualties. The British bombers were preparing to launch another massive attack on the city, but aerial reconnaissance revealed that the smoke clouds from the previous assaults covered Hamburg, making target identification difficult. For this reason, the Royal Air Force headquarters decided not to attack Hamburg that night, but to order the 705 British bombers on standby to target Essen. Marshal Arthur Harris again ordered the use of the window technique, and the operation was another success, losing only 26 units during the attack. But the British were determined not to let the people of Hamburg rest. On the night of July 25th, 6 de Havilland Mosquitoes from Squadron No. 139 of the Light Night Strike Force conducted operations over the city to keep the citizens and authorities on alert. The next day, the United States Air Force executed a new attack on several targets in northern Germany. The orders were the same. The 6 groups that had bombed Hamburg the day before were to repeat their attacks on the same targets. The other bombing units were tasked with attacking the Conti rubber factory in Hanover. 121 B-17 took off from British territory to attack Hamburg, but due to formation problems, bad weather, and several early returns, only 54 units dropped bombs on the city. Most of the smoke covering the city the previous day had dissipated, so the Germans had to use artificial smoke to mask the port. Despite this, by noon, the American planes bombed secondary buildings, such as the Howaldtswerk Deutsche Werft submarine shipyard. Moreover, they achieved a key success by directly hitting the Neuhof power plant, which supplied the shipyards and the port. The power plant remained out of service for a month, depriving Hamburg of 40% of its electricity production capacity at a critical time. The attack caused 150 additional civilian deaths. German anti-aircraft fire only managed to damage 2 planes, which got lost on the return trip to England. Meanwhile, German leaders decided to concentrate their fighter attacks against the bombers attacking Hanover. Like Hamburg and Essen, that night the city of Hanover would suffer an attack by the British Royal Air Force. Most of the firefighters in that city had gone to aid Hamburg, so the fires caused much greater damage. More than 1,000 buildings were destroyed or severely damaged, and about 250 people lost their lives in Hanover. On July 27th, a reconnaissance mission reported that most of the smoke clouds covering Hamburg had dissipated. The senior officials of the British Royal Air Force, led by Marshal Arthur Harris, decided to continue Operation Gomorrah that same night, ordering nearly 800 bombers to reduce to ashes whatever remained of Hamburg. Shortly after sunset, the planes took off. In the city, vast areas were still ablaze. The urban infrastructure was on the verge of collapse, while tens of thousands of people who had lost everything began moving toward the east of Hamburg. Burgfelder, Hamm, Barmbek, and Hohenfelder, 4 of the most densely populated working-class neighborhoods, served as refuges. And from their apartments, where no one could enter anymore, thousands of people watched the fire consume the other part of the city. The weather that night was warm and dry, and the British knew it. Like the biblical city of Gomorrah, that night, fire would fall from the sky on Hamburg.